Everyone thinks they already know how this story goes. The squint, the poncho, the six-shooter, the rogue cop who didn't play by the rules. 70 years of that image, carved so deep into pop culture that most people couldn't tell you a single detail about the man underneath it. But here's what almost nobody talks about. There is one single year, recent enough that most of his fans haven't fully processed it yet, that took more from Clint Eastwood than 7 decades of Hollywood ever did. Not a scandal, not a flop. Something quieter and somehow far more brutal. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the toughest man in American cinema chose, at 96 years old, to simply disappear. Not because the industry pushed him out, because of what he'd lost. Stick around, because the reason involves 2 women, a decade apart, and a coincidence so cruel it barely feels real. But to understand how a man ends up carrying that kind of weight in complete silence, you have to go all the way back to where the silence started, long before the gun holster. Long before the director's chair, back to a kid who almost never made it out of the Great Depression, let alone into legend. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, California, at almost the exact moment the American economy was collapsing around his family. His father, Clinton Sr., bounced between whatever work existed, a steel worker one year, a gas station clerk the next, while his mother, Ruth, picked up factory shifts to help keep the lights on. Here's the part most biographies skip past too quickly. The Eastwoods didn't just struggle financially, they never stayed anywhere long enough to build roots. The family chased work across California, up into Oregon and Washington, which meant that by the time Clint hit his teenage years, he had already changed schools more times than he could easily count. He was tall, gangly, painfully thin, and constantly the new kid standing at the edge of a classroom he'd only just learned the layout of. Classmates would later describe him as almost invisible, a boy who watched far more than he ever spoke. Stop and think about that for a second. The trait that made him a legend, that ice-cold, saying-nothing screen presence that defined an entire genre of American cinema, wasn't a technique he studied. It was a survival habit from a childhood where talking too much just made you an easier target. He worked as a lumberjack, a firefighter, a gas station attendant, long before anyone ever handed him a script. There was no scholarship waiting, no family connections in entertainment, nothing that suggested the awkward, drifting teenager would end up one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. If anything, the odds said the opposite. Picture that for a second, a lanky kid hauling lumber in the Pacific Northwest, moving from one temporary address to the next, with absolutely no reason to believe his name would ever mean anything outside his own household. That's the version of Clint Eastwood nobody puts on a poster, but it's the version that actually explains everything that came after. And then, at 21 years old, something happened that almost erased the entire story before it began. In 1951, Eastwood was drafted into the army during the Korean War. He never saw combat. He was stationed at Fort Ord in California, training soldiers to swim. It should have been the safest posting imaginable. Instead, flying home on leave, the Navy plane he was in ran out of fuel mid-flight and went down in the Pacific Ocean, off the coast near Point Reyes. Eastwood had to swim close to 2 miles through freezing open water just to reach dry land. Think about that. The man who would spend a career playing characters who cheat death on screen actually cheated it. For real. In the cold Pacific, years before a single camera ever pointed at him. He rarely discussed it publicly in detail. When he did, he described it the same flat, matter-of-fact way he described almost everything else in his life. It happened. He survived. Moving on. But that near-death swim wasn't the end of his obstacles. It was barely the beginning, because the industry he was about to enter had absolutely no interest in him either. After his discharge, Eastwood drifted toward Los Angeles with no real plan of becoming an actor, enrolling at Los Angeles City College to study business. A chance encounter with a cinematographer led to a screen test at Universal Studios, and here's the detail almost nobody expects. Executives who saw that first test didn't walk away impressed. Reports from the period described them finding his neck too thick, his manner too flat, his talent, frankly, unclear. He spent years stuck in Hollywood's minor leagues, picking up bit parts in forgettable monster movies and war pictures, the kind of films history politely forgets. By 1959, Universal cut him loose entirely. For most actors, that's the ending. Full stop, career over, go find something else to do with your life. For Eastwood, it was just the setup for the twist nobody saw coming. Here's a detail that rarely makes the highlight reel. In the years between getting cut by Universal and landing his next real opportunity, Eastwood took whatever work he could find just to stay afloat, digging swimming pools, working construction, picking up the kind of physical labor that leaves calluses instead of headshots. He wasn't sitting around waiting for Hollywood to call him back. He genuinely wasn't sure it ever would. That's the part that makes what happened next so strange, because the break, when it finally came, wasn't glamorous either. That same year, he landed the role of Rowdy Yates on the television western Rawhide. Steady work, mild fame, a face people vaguely recognized from their living rooms. Nothing more. But it was enough to get him noticed by an Italian director named Sergio Leone, who was casting a low-budget western shot in Spain on a script that had quietly lifted its plot from a Japanese samurai film. Leone needed an American lead cheap enough to fit a shoestring budget and desperate enough to work far from Hollywood's radar. Eastwood, whose television career had stalled, took the gamble. The film was A Fistful of Dollars, released in 1964. It introduced the world to a nameless, poncho-wearing gunslinger who barely spoke and never seemed to blink. 2 sequels followed, and together they became the Dollars Trilogy. American critics initially trashed the films as cheap European knockoffs. Audiences disagreed completely. The man Universal Studios once found unremarkable was suddenly the face of an entirely new kind of Western hero. But here's where it gets interesting, because Eastwood wasn't satisfied being famous. He wanted to be in control. In 1971, Eastwood stepped into the role of Inspector Harry Callahan in Dirty Harry, a film so controversial it split critics right down the middle, some calling it a celebration of vigilante justice, others calling it exactly the movie a nervous, crime-weary country needed. Whichever side people landed on, the character stuck to Eastwood for the rest of his life. That same year, he directed his first film, Play Misty for Me, a modest psychological thriller that revealed something important. He didn't just want to stand in front of the camera, he wanted to build the whole thing from behind it. Through his own production company, Malpaso, he carved out something almost no action star of his era had: real creative independence, the freedom to choose smaller, stranger, more personal projects, even while studios kept begging him for another shoot-'em-up. Here's the twist most casual fans miss entirely. It took nearly 2 decades before Hollywood actually respected him as a filmmaker, instead of just a box office draw. That respect arrived in 1992 with Unforgiven, a bleak, unglamorous western that tore apart the exact mythology Eastwood had helped build in his younger years. The film won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Overnight, the squinting cowboy became one of the most respected directors in America, and he didn't stop proving it was real. Mystic River in 2003, $1 Million Baby in 2004, a second Best Picture and Best Director win. Letters from Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Fathers, 2 companion films examining the same war from opposite sides, both released in 2006. American Sniper in 2014, one of the highest-grossing war films ever made. And here's the part that should stop you cold. He was still directing films at 94 years old. Cry Macho in 2021. Juror Number 2 in 2024. A courtroom drama so well-reviewed that critics openly questioned why the studio barely released it. Across more than 4 decades behind the camera, he directed roughly 40 feature films and guided 5 different actors to Academy Award wins. Somewhere in the middle of all that, he even got himself elected mayor of the small California town he called home, almost as an afterthought to a career that was already overflowing. Here's what makes that run even harder to believe. Most directors get 1 great decade if they're lucky, one stretch where the scripts, the timing, and the awards all line up before the industry moves on to somebody younger. Eastwood strung together 4 separate decades of acclaimed work, from the 70s all the way through the 2020s, without ever fully stepping away and without ever fully repeating himself. Executives who once found him unremarkable were now handing him final cut on his own films almost automatically. But fame at that scale, sustained across 70 years, always demands something in return. For Clint Eastwood, the price wasn't paid in bad reviews or box office flops. It was paid somewhere much more private. Professionally, it looks like an unbroken, impossible streak of wins. Personally, it's a completely different story, and this is where things start to get genuinely messy. Here's the contradiction almost nobody expects. A man whose entire screen persona was built on control, discipline, saying less and meaning more, spent his real life doing almost the exact opposite in his relationships. In 1953, he married Maggie Johnson, a young model he met before his acting career had even started. On paper, it lasted until 1984, over 30 years. In practice, biographers who spent years studying his life describe it as anything but simple. Eastwood openly viewed traditional marriage as something close to confinement, and he carried on numerous relationships outside that marriage, some brief, some lasting years, several of them producing children. Maggie herself didn't find out about until much later. Their first daughter together was given up for adoption at birth and only reunited with her father decades afterward, a preview of just how complicated this family tree was about to get. During that same marriage, Eastwood had a long relationship with stuntwoman Roxanne Tunis, with whom he had a daughter. Then came actress Sondra Locke, a relationship that began in the mid-1970s and lasted roughly 14 years, both personally and professionally, as the two appeared together in film after film through the late 70s and 80s. From the outside, it looked like one of Hollywood's more stable, long-term pairings. Here's what almost nobody realized until it was too late. It had been quietly falling apart for years before it ever became public. When it ended in 1989, it didn't end quietly. It exploded into a legal battle so ugly it became one of the most talked-about court sagas in Hollywood, with Locke later alleging she'd been misled during a settlement involving a development deal that never materialized the way she was promised. Neither side walked away from that fight looking particularly good, and for years afterward, entertainment reporters treated the case as a kind of cautionary tale about what happens when a long relationship in Hollywood ends without a clear, mutual understanding of where things actually stood. And that wasn't even the end of the list. Around the same period, he was also involved with actress Frances Fisher, with whom he had another daughter, and separately with flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves, who gave birth to two more of his children. In 1996, at 66 years old, he married again, this time to former television news anchor Dina Ruiz, and the two had a daughter before separating in 2013. Add it all up and you get 8 children, with 6 different women, across roughly 4 decades, a family so sprawling that some of his own kids didn't meet each other until they were fully grown adults. Here's the part that genuinely surprises people. Despite all of that complexity, most of his children have avoided airing their grievances publicly, appearing together at premieres and family events far more often than they've appeared in tabloid feuds. Here's the strange twist in all of it. Given how publicly messy his romantic history looks on paper, court battles, secret children, overlapping relationships spanning decades, you'd expect Eastwood's reputation to have taken a serious hit somewhere along the way. It never really did. Audiences kept showing up for his films. Studios kept handing him bigger budgets. Somehow, the same man whose private life read like a soap opera kept being trusted with some of the most serious, morally complicated stories Hollywood ever told. Whatever chaos existed behind closed doors, it never once bled into the calm, controlled image he projected everywhere else. But none of those relationships, not the marriages, not the affairs, not even the courtroom battle with Locke, would end up being the loss that finally broke through Eastwood's legendary composure. That loss was still years away, and when it arrived, it didn't come alone. His children, several of whom built their own careers in front of or behind cameras, carry pieces of that legacy forward today. One of his sons became a leading man in his own right, headlining blockbuster franchises and war dramas, drawing constant comparisons to his father's early rugged screen presence, comparisons he's welcomed and quietly tried to outgrow at the same time. Another moved into music, scoring several of his father's own films from behind a piano rather than in front of a camera, a working relationship most fathers and sons never get the chance to share. Others drifted into acting, producing, and writing, each one carrying a small piece of the Eastwood name into rooms their father never personally set foot in. His last major relationship began around 2014 with Christina Sandera, a former hostess at the restaurant on his own Mission Ranch property in Carmel by the Sea. Unlike almost every woman before her, Sandera had no career in entertainment and no visible interest in the spotlight that came attached to Clint Eastwood's name. People close to the couple described it as unusually calm for him, a full decade of quiet companionship instead of headline-grabbing romance. It would also, without either of them knowing it, turn out to be the last great love of his life. And this is where the story stops being about fame and starts being about something much harder to watch. Here's the thing nobody expected from a man who spent his career playing characters that seemed impossible to break. In July of 2024, Christina Sandera died suddenly of a heart attack. She was 61 years old. 10 years by his side, gone in an instant. Eastwood, a man who had spent decades refusing to discuss his private life in any real detail, confirmed her death publicly with a short, restrained statement, saying only that she'd been a lovely, caring woman and that he would miss her very much. For a man that guarded, even that single sentence carried enormous weight. But here's the detail that makes 2024 almost unbearable to sit with. That same year, Maggie Johnson, his first wife, the mother of two of his children, the woman who shared the earliest, hungriest years of his rise to fame, also passed away. Two women, decades apart in his life, gone within months of each other. The first wife who watched him become a star, and the quiet partner who watched him become an old man, both taken from him in the same 12 months. It gets heavier. Sondra Locke, the partner whose breakup with Eastwood once filled tabloid pages and courtroom transcripts, had already died back in 2018, after a long fight with cancer, largely out of the public eye by that point, her once prominent career having faded years before. By the time Eastwood reached his mid-90s, the list of people who had shared the most significant chapters of his life kept getting shorter and shorter, and there was nothing left to do but keep living through it. Think about how strange that timeline actually is. A partnership that once dominated tabloids for years ended in a courtroom and then simply faded out of public memory long before its final chapter, a woman fighting an illness largely alone, out of the spotlight that once refused to leave her alone. And Eastwood, the man at the center of that entire story, watching from a distance, saying almost nothing about it publicly, the same way he'd said almost nothing about anything for 70 years. So what does a 96-year-old man do after absorbing that kind of loss? If you guessed press conferences, tribute specials, a farewell tour, you'd be wrong, because that's not who Clint Eastwood has ever been. He skipped the premiere of Juror Number 2 in 2024 entirely, which immediately set off speculation that his health was failing, speculation that occasionally spiraled into outright hoaxes, falsely claiming he had died. His representatives had to step in more than once just to confirm he was alive. In 2025, a European outlet published an interview quoting him as frustrated with the modern film industry and insisting he had no plans to retire. Eastwood personally contacted Deadline to say the conversation never happened the way it was reported, correcting the record himself rather than letting a fabricated story define him. A small moment, but a telling one. A 95-year-old man still protective enough of his own narrative to push back against a version he hadn't approved. And then, even that defiance quietly faded. By the following year, his son Kyle, in an interview given to French media, confirmed what many had already suspected. Clint Eastwood had retired. Not with an announcement. Not with an emotional final bow in front of cameras. The exact same way he's done almost everything else in his life, without a word of explanation. People close to him say he now splits his time between his longtime home in California and a quieter existence in Hawaii, uninterested by every account in Hollywood tributes or send-offs. Juror Number 2 now stands as his final work behind the camera, a courtroom drama about ordinary people forced to confront difficult truths, an oddly fitting final chapter for a director who spent 7 decades avoiding easy answers. Here's the math that makes this genuinely hard to sit with. Turning 96 means almost by mathematical certainty outliving an enormous share of the people who mattered most to you. A first wife, a famous turbulent partner from his younger years, a quiet, steady companion from what should have been his easiest decade. Colleagues, co-stars, friends from a 70-year career, most of whom simply aren't there anymore to call, to work with, or to sit across from at the dinners he rarely attended anyway. Longevity, for a man who has now outlived so much of his own history, comes with a very specific kind of loneliness, one that has nothing to do with money or fame and everything to do with an ever-shrinking circle of people who remember the same version of events he does. And yet, here's the part that flips the whole story. Despite everything, by every available account, Eastwood hasn't collapsed into bitterness or public despair. He hasn't complained. He hasn't sat for a single tell-all interview explaining how hard it's been. Friends and family describe a man who remains sharp, active, and characteristically understated about his own hardships, the exact same quiet discipline that carried him through a childhood shaped by economic collapse, now carrying him through an old age shaped by unavoidable loss. He never wanted sympathy for any of it, and by every account from the people closest to him, he never particularly wanted an audience for his private grief either. Which, if you think about it, might be the most fitting ending imaginable for this specific man. He built an entire screen legacy around saying almost nothing and letting silence carry the weight instead. Turns out, decades later, real life handed him more than enough reasons to keep exactly that same quiet composure. Whatever hardship has shadowed his personal life, his professional legacy is close to unmatched in American film history. Few actors of his generation made the leap from screen icon to respected filmmaker. Fewer still did it twice, first reinventing the Western into something darker with the Dollars Trilogy and Dirty Harry, then reinventing himself again decades later as one of the industry's most consistently awarded directors. He guided 5 different actors to Oscar wins. He built one of the most durable independent production structures in Hollywood through Malpaso, buying himself creative freedom even during decades when studios wanted nothing from him but another action picture. He got himself elected mayor of a small town almost as a footnote. And even into his 90s, long after most of his peers had quietly stepped away, he was still walking onto set, still directing, still working at a pace that would exhaust filmmakers a third of his age. So here we are. Today, by every account from people close to him, Clint Eastwood lives almost entirely removed from the industry that made him a household name, splitting his time between California and a quieter life in Hawaii. He isn't chasing one more project. He isn't angling for a farewell tribute. He isn't granting the kind of career-spanning sit-down interviews so many legends of his stature eventually give into. His son has confirmed simply that he's retired, and the family has handled that announcement the exact same understated way Eastwood has handled almost everything in his public life. He's still, by most reports, sharp, active, and recognizably himself, just no longer interested in anyone watching him do it. No documentary crews trailing him around Carmel. No tearful late-night interview walking through the highlights reel of a 70-year career. If Clint Eastwood is going to spend his final years the way he spent almost every year before them, it will be quietly, on his own terms, far from any camera he doesn't personally control. Remember that year we opened with? The one that took more from him than 70 years in Hollywood ever did? Now you know exactly what it cost him. Christina. Maggie. Both gone within months of each other, arriving on top of a lifetime of losses that had already been quietly stacking up for decades. That's the real tragedy hiding underneath the headline. Not scandal, not a public collapse, just the accumulated weight of outliving so much of your own story, carried the same way he's always carried everything else, privately, quietly, without asking a single person to watch him do it. So here's the question worth sitting with. Was Clint Eastwood's most defining moment the squint that launched 1,000 imitators, the Oscar-winning films that turned him into one of the most respected directors alive? Or was it these last few years, the quiet losses almost nobody got to see up close, carried by a man who never once asked for sympathy? Tell me which one in the comments below, and if stories about the real people hiding underneath the legends are ones you want more of, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you.